And welcome to the Worst Is Yet to Come podcast. I'm Harry. This is Andrew.
Hey man, how's it going?
Good. What's up?
Well, dude, happy to be here. Happy to get this rolling. I've had a lot of people reach out to us after we announced this on social media saying we're starting a podcast, and they're really excited to hear what we have to say. So this is just a quick little 5 to 10 minute video or audio of us talking about, what we're going to do here. So let's get into it, Harry.
Yeah, absolutely.
What got you interested in history?
I've always loved history ever since I was a little kid. One of the first book series I read in elementary school was called the Magic Treehouse series, and it followed this brother and sister through different periods in time. Like they would go on these crazy missions for Merlin from the King Arthur stories.
I think I remember that.
And so it had these kids going to medieval England, Sengoku Jidai period Japan. And so I was fourth or fifth grade, I think, when I started reading those, and I just really fell in love with that series. And then as I got older into I think fifth grade too, it was fourth and fifth grade, I think it was, where I read it was the Percy Jackson series of books. It follows this kid who's he's like a demigod, but it's in modern day New York City, and he learns out he's the son of Poseidon, and he gets attacked by the Minotaur, and he gets taken to a camp for kids that are just like him, and he trains and learns oh, there's forces of evil that want to kill demigods and all this kind of stuff, and that threw me into the world of ancient Greece and that whole thing. And in addition to that, my dad growing up would have the History Channel on pretty much nonstop, and so that left kind of big imprint on me. And even to this day, a lot of the free time I'm reading history books, and in college, I'm in college right now to be a teacher, and I'm majoring in history, and history's still very much a big part of my life and will be part of my life for the rest of it. So, and my favorite historical subjects are World Wars I, II, the Russian Civil War. I think is really interesting, the whole history of the politics and the real nitty gritty part of the Russian Civil War. And I love Napoleonic era Europe. Medieval Europe, Sengoku Jidai period Japan, all the the Warring States period of Japan is really interesting to me. I wanted to. I thought of just saying my favorite documentary film is Ken Burns' The Civil War. If anyone hasn't seen that, go watch that. It's probably one of the best documentaries ever made, if not the best. It's a really touching kind of story about the Civil War. Follows it from the full spectrum of, all of the aspects of the Civil War. Just everything is covered, essentially.
The cool thing about the Civil War for you is I know you have family that was fighting the Civil War. I think that's pretty cool. It's an interesting connection for you.
Yeah. I had family that fought on both sides, so it's really just doing my family history is really interesting, and seeing the kind of how different, the different sides, but also how similar those in my family, at least, the people were they fought for two different sides, but on both sides they were farmers or simple, just normal people. But it kind of shows the disparity of the Civil War, and that documentary very much highlighted the common aspect of what the Civil War epitomized. And that's just, in my opinion, one of the greatest documentary films of all time, if not the best. And I also love the work of Akira Kurosawa. He's a Japanese director who made a lot of Sengoku era works that follow samurais, or their daimyos, the lords and things like that. And he was really known for adapting Shakespearean works into that period of Japan. And so it's this really it's really compelling stories with these, historically Japanese characters. It's really interesting. And some of my favorite films include Gettysburg. That's like 4 hour long movie.
That's such a good movie. It's such a good movie, man.
It's so good. Zulu, which I know is your favorite movie.
Yeah, Zulu is my favorite movie.
I love Tora Tora Tora. And I love the movie U-Boat. It's like the German movie.
That's such a good one.
So good, dude. But tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, man. So when I was a young kid, my uncle died, and he was in the Canadian Army Reserves, like in the 60s and 70s. So he was into that kind of stuff. And when he died, I got all these VHS tapes that were all like documentaries, and it was like modern jets, aircraft carriers, like World War II. It's just a whole like, one of those like, I don't know. It's like a whole collection set of like VHS tapes.
Yeah.
So I watched those when I was a kid, and I wore them out because I just kept watching them. So, as I got older, I started like getting books about World War II. When you're young, you get like picture books and you get all interested. And then more and more older I get, I started watching war movies, and then that turned into, researching stuff. And then as time progressed, just all I do is just read books about history.
Yeah.
And listen to podcasts all day while I'm working. So unlike you, you're in school for this stuff. I'm not. I do all my education through podcasts while I'm working. I work with my hands all day. I'm a welder. So I spend 9 hours a day, 10 hours a day just listening to podcasts about history. It's just what keeps me going is learning about all this cool stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, the cool thing, just like you, is like looking up family history, right? So I had family that was in both World Wars, specifically looking into World War I. I had family on the in the British Army. I had family in the Canadian Army. So looking at like, hey, my ancestor was at Passchendaele. He was at Vimy. One of them died at the Battle of Arras. It's like super interesting stuff to me. It's super cool. It turns out one of my grandma's brothers fought in the jungles of Burma. Super cool stuff that just like grabs my interest. And what I really like about history is like, if you could read like a grand strategy book, to me that's boring. I like to read like people's biographies, autobiographies, the personal stories of these dudes and like the stuff that they went through, and I find it like really inspiring. So actually I was at the gym the other day, and I was chatting it up with this guy, and we're just chatting about like fitness and life or whatever, and he asked me, he's like, hey, like what inspires you? And in the moment I was like, oh, I don't know, like I can't think. I said, oh, I don't know. And then now that we started this podcast and we're talking about like history and just thinking about the stuff that I'm interested in, the answer I should have gave this guy was like, what inspires me? History. That's what it is. Great people like Julius Caesar. I'm talking about, Sir Arthur Currie, guys like Stonewall Jackson. It's just guys that have like great leadership principles are the people in history that inspire me.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I mean, besides that, like I said, I had family in the British military, Canadian military, so I'm really into like the British Empire. So like I'm obsessed with the Duke of Wellington. I'm obsessed with like, the whole Zulu War, Rorke's Drift, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Anything British, I'm like an Anglophile. I love any of that stuff. It's all interesting to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty much it,
Yeah.
So why do you think we're starting this podcast?
Well, for me, I've always wanted to do a podcast of some kind, and I think that me and you have a lot of the same interests, and it's like the perfect kind of storm of like we both are really into like all of the same kind of subjects and all that kind of stuff. We love talking about it, and we just kind of figured, it just made sense to. Hey, we should just record this. Everyone and their mom's got a podcast already. It's like, why not us?
Exactly. It's like the conversations that we would have while we're just hanging out, chatting online, playing video games, are the ones that we should just record because it's conversations.
Yeah.
Hell yeah, man. So, besides that, like, what are you looking forward to? What kind of subjects do you think you're gonna want to talk about? And then, hopefully we can get some guests on. So, our mission statement, what do you think that's all about?
Yeah. I just think that I'm looking, like specific subjects I'm looking forward to is I really want us to dive into the Civil War. I know we got our first episode coming up about Stonewall Jackson, and I'm looking forward to that. And I want us to I'd really like to get to delve more into the Civil War eventually. Battles and leaders from that conflict and all that kind of stuff. And I'd also like to delve into the American Revolution, but also like a ton of the like World War I, World War II. I want to that whole gamut of all the things I said I found interesting. I'd love to just dive into like all of that and discuss the historical figures, the men and women that were kind of leading the charge throughout history. And I want to get down to like the nitty gritty of like what motivated them, and I'd also like to look at it like strategically or like tactically, and at least on the surface level a little bit. And like I want to capture the scope of these conflicts that a lot of people kind of forget about. Like you talk about World War I, World War II, and you forget that like tens of millions of people died. Like maybe people don't forget that about like World War II, but like the American Civil War is like the most costliest conflict in American history, like by far. Like no other conflict is like all the other conflicts combined throughout American history is just dwarfed by the amount of Americans that were killed in the American Civil War. And I think that us talking about this will kind of like help bring light to some less discussed or like less talked about periods throughout history and conflicts throughout history. And but I also want to highlight, like you were saying, the people. I want to look at what motivates people and why they did the things that they did, and why they thought the way they thought and things like that. So I'm very much looking forward to doing all that and just really tackling pretty much whatever interests us, week by week.
I like what you're saying about like the leaders, because something that's been like a recent interest of mine is like leadership, the concept of leadership, right? So we're talking about these historical figures who've done these amazing things, who are just normal people like you and I, and you wonder like, how do they get people to follow them? How do they get people to do like insane things? And it comes down to just good quality leadership. And these people are just amazing leaders. Yeah. And that's what I'm look forward to talking to about the most, especially our first episode about Stonewall Jackson, because he was a very unique person and he had such a interesting life where that rolls into his leadership style. And just stuff like that is what I think is like amazing about history.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are you looking forward to besides the things I mentioned, or what I know you said you're Anglophile, so I'm not too familiar with British history beyond common knowledge of like I know about like the 7 Years' War and pretty much any British history that has to do with American history.
Yeah, well, there's some cool things that I want to talk about. Like obviously like the Anglo-Zulu War, which I love. Like I said, I love the movie Zulu. Yeah. I have a Martini Henry. I love that whole stuff. Stuff like the reconquest of Sudan. Winston Churchill was there as a young man. Like that's super interesting. I have his book, The River War, and I kind of want to like go through some of these books that I have and just kind of make an episode about a book. And we can
absolutely.
Do almost like a book report and just discuss the book, because like it's like the most, I don't know, like most of these like autobiographies are like the most pure form of history. It's just dudes talking about what they did. So like like I said, talk about the conquest of Sudan, the Zulu War. There's a lot of like, I say Victorian era English kind of stuff that they were doing, like in Afghanistan. They were also dabbling in in China at the time. Like there's all this crazy stuff they're doing. Like a lot of Canadian history too, obviously. I'm Canadian.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cool things about Canadian history that like not everyone actually knows a lot about.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be cool to go over some of that stuff.
Yeah. Me personally, I think that I would like to know more about, in terms of Canadian history, I'd like to know more about how, because Canada's it's just so damn big. Like people think like America is like a big country, but like you look at like a map, like Canada's huge. So like I'd like to know how they went from these really like humble beginnings in the East to like getting all the way out west. Because in America we talk, it's known like Lewis and Clark. They went, their mission was to go get to the west. You know what I mean? But you don't really it's not really a common knowledge like Canada had to do the same thing, and
Yeah.
I think it'd be really interesting to hear like from you about like how Canada went from the East Coast and got to the West Coast and all the trials and tribulations of all of those really tough dudes who did that.
Was a cool thing that happened. It was called the Red River Rebellion, and it was a bunch of Métis Native Americans that pretty much rose up against the government. Just because their rights weren't being followed,
Yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah,
The Red River. You got the March West from the RCMP when they formed the Northwest Mounted Police, and they actually went out west to police the plains. We got the Trans Canada railway that was built. America built their railway after the Civil War. Well, Canada had the same thing. We built our own railway.
yeah. Like that's what I'm saying. It's like it's kind of like we're kind of like insulated of like, at least I feel that way about like other countries. It's like Canada is like it's right there, like it's just north, and like Mexico's like just south. But it's like I just for one, feel very insulated by the kind of American education system. I don't want to like dog on it too bad, but I because obviously like when you're in school you take like the history of the country you live in, obviously.
Well, yeah.
But it's as interesting as you find the history of like Canada, and as interesting as I find the history of America. Like looking at like vice versa, like the history of Canada to me and the history of America to you is also like just so interesting because, and like you're saying, like geographically, our countries are very similar in their history of like, well, they had to get west, like guys had to do that, and like literally it was guys slogging their way across these giant, throngs of land, and they had to fight nature, natives, all this kind of stuff, and it's just crazy the story of like how they got there and that kind of thing. And I'd really like us to also examine that of like, the kind of as our nations grew, what they had to do to kind of get to where they are. Like, and I want to look at the good and bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, no country has like a clean history, and there's a lot of, bad things that went down in both our histories. Specifically
Yeah.
Canada, right? The residential schools. I had family members that were, Indigenous Canadians, and they were involved in those schools, and it's absolutely terrible and something that we have to go over in our history and talk about.
Yeah, I think that's a big point with me. Is like I love history, and like growing up, so many people ask me like, man, how do you do it? Like, how do you remember all that stuff? And it's like, I never really had an answer. It just came second nature to me. But like now, I got older and I can kind of formulate a response better than that. And to me, it's just that kind of like old saying of like, you learn from if you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think that's very true. Like, if you don't know about the kind of stuff that's happened throughout history and like just what people could be capable of doing, you kind of lose like the scope of just what we could do.
It's just like people say, history repeats itself.
Yeah. And I feel like if we don't examine it through the good and bad, then and you like only look at it from like one side and you get a biased view of history, then you're going to evolve like going into the future in a biased way, and you're not going to go on the path that you kind of need to, like, and that's like culturally, societally speaking, like politically speaking. I think that if people like generally don't know their history and they don't kind of take in the good and the bad of it, they're very much doomed to repeat what the generations before them did. And I think that that's a big part of history for me is looking at it from the good and bad, because for every skyscraper, or for every like company that was founded to define America, there's someone who lost their business, like for every Ford, there's, a company that failed, and but I like looking at it like that. It's like it's good, and it's like you were saying, like good and bad. And I want to look at both kind of the degrees of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's well said. That's well said. I don't know what else I could really add to that. Yeah, it's perfect statement about what we're looking forward to do. So that's awesome, man. Well, thanks for getting together and recording this kind of intro episode. And we'll have to get back together soon and film the first episode and get that all out and published.
Yeah, just everyone be on the lookout for episode 1 of the Worst Is Yet to Come podcast, and it'll be on Stonewall Jackson.
Yeah, so follow us on Instagram and Facebook at the Worst Is Yet to Come podcast. The socials will be linked and everything, so yeah, take a look.
And we're on Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts. We should be anywhere that you can get podcasts. So just go on your respective podcast platform and look us up. We should be on there.